Brigadier General Thomas Wicker stood in the Combined Operations Center at Bien Hoa in the spring of 1968 and read the Australian after-action report from the Long Green, with the specific expression of a man who has just been handed a document that confirms something he has been thinking for 6 months but has been too diplomatically careful to say directly. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at the Australian liaison officer, a lieutenant colonel named Pemberton from the 1st Australian Task Force, and said the words that would define the next 3 months of combined operations in Phuc Tuy province. "They're leaving money on the table," Wicker said. Pemberton was 52 years old and had the compressed, deliberate manner of a career officer who had learned through long experience that the most dangerous moment in any conversation with a senior American general was the moment when the general stated something that sounded like an operational preference and was actually a decision. He looked at Wicker with the careful attention of a man identifying that moment. "Sir," he said, "the SAS hit and retreat doctrine is specifically designed to—" "I know what it's designed to do," Wicker said. He was not unkind about it. He was precise. "It's designed to maintain patrol viability by breaking contact before the enemy can mass a response. I understand the logic." "I'm telling you, the logic is costing us opportunities we cannot afford to leave on the floor." He pointed to the after-action report. The relevant section was the 3rd page, the contact engagement summary. An SAS patrol of 6 men had made contact with a Viet Cong element, engaged for 47 seconds, inflicted an estimated 8 casualties, and broken contact to extract. The enemy element had been assessed at company strength, approximately 120 men. The SAS patrol had engaged 8 of them and departed. 112 men, Wicker said, walking away, intact, carrying weapons and supplies and the specific knowledge that they had just been contacted by a coalition patrol and were now free to go back to doing whatever they were doing before we interrupted them for 47 seconds. Pemberton looked at the report. The patrol maintained its integrity. No Australian casualties. The intelligence product from the contact. The intelligence product tells us where 112 Viet Cong were 47 seconds before the patrol broke contact. It does not tell us where they are now. Wicker moved to the map. "This is my problem with the hit and retreat doctrine, Colonel. It produces contacts and then abandons them. The contact is the opening. In American doctrine, the contact is the beginning of the engagement, not the engagement itself." Pemberton had heard variations of this argument before. The American frustration with Australian small unit tactics in general, and the SAS hit and retreat doctrine specifically, was not new. It had been present in the combined operations discussions since the 1st Australian Task Force deployed to Phuc Tuy, and had produced a steady undertone of Allied friction that the diplomatic machinery of the combined headquarters worked continuously to manage. What was different about this specific instance was Wicker. He was not a staff officer expressing institutional preferences. He was a 2-star general who had commanded infantry in Korea and who had an operational record that made his opinions on contact doctrine something more than the preferences of a man who had not been in the relevant situation. He had been in the relevant situation. He had been in it many times. And his conclusion from those situations was that the moment of contact was the moment of maximum opportunity, and that departing that moment voluntarily, as the SAS hit and retreat doctrine required, was a choice to forfeit the opportunity at its peak. "I'd like to understand the doctrine better," Wicker said. "Not from the paperwork, from the people who run it." He looked at Pemberton. "Arrange a meeting with the SAS squadron commander and the patrol commanders who ran the Long Green contact. I want to hear it from them, directly." The meeting happened at Nui Dat, 4 days later, Wicker flew in on a Huey that he piloted himself for the last 20 minutes of the flight, which was a fact that circulated through the Nui Dot base within an hour of his arrival, and that produced in the people who heard it a range of responses from impressed to deeply unsettled, depending on their relationship with the concept of generals doing things that generals did not conventionally do. The SAS squadron commander was a major named Hartington, who was 44 years old and had the specific quality of a man who had spent his entire career being correct about things that other people had initially disputed, and had developed from this experience a patience with being disputed that was entirely free of defensiveness, because he had found that patience was always vindicated. He briefed the hit and retreat doctrine with the thoroughness that the SAS applied to all formal presentations, systematic, detailed, with the specific emphasis on the logic rather than the outcomes that reflected the Australian military's preference for explaining the why before the what. The logic was sound. Wicker acknowledged this as Hartington presented it. A 6-man patrol in contact with a company-strength enemy element was in a situation where the mathematical relationship between the two forces favored the enemy overwhelmingly if the contact was sustained beyond the initial surprise advantage. The first 47 seconds of a contact, before the enemy could organize a coordinated response, belonged to the patrol. The subsequent period belonged to the enemy. Breaking contact at the 47-second mark preserved the patrol and the intelligence it had gathered. Sustaining contact beyond that point risked the patrol against odds that no amount of training or firepower could reliably overcome. "The math is right," Wicker said when Hartington finished. "I'm not disputing the math. I'm disputing the conclusion the math produces." Hartington looked at him. "Sir?" "The math tells you that sustaining contact with a company strength element with 6 men is unsustainable. Correct. It does not tell you that the only option when you make contact with a company strength element is 6 men." Wicker spread a map on the table. "What if the 6 men's job is not to win the contact, but to fix the contact while something that can win it arrives?" The room was quiet for a moment. Hartington looked at the map. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that contains an argument he has not fully considered and is now considering for the first time in the specific context of the person who has just made it. The patrol would need to know that reinforcement was available and would arrive within the sustainability window. The sustainability window is 47 seconds before the enemy organizes. What if we extend that window? With what? Wicker looked at him. "With what we bring to every contact that you don't bring to yours. Artillery, close air support, a reaction force that is pre-positioned for exactly this contingency." He paused. "You make contact. You fix the enemy. You call the fire. The fire extends your sustainability window from 47 seconds to however long you can maintain the fix. The reaction force arrives. The contact becomes a battle. The battle is on terms we choose because we chose the contact." Hartington was quiet. He was doing something in his mind that was visible in the specific quality of his silence. Not the resistance silence of a man protecting a position, but the processing silence of a man genuinely working through a proposal against the framework he had spent his career building. "The patrol's role changes," he said finally. "It becomes a fixing force rather than an independent maneuver element." "The patrol's role expands," Wicker said. "It retains all its current capability and adds the capability to hold contact long enough for the larger system to engage. Which requires the patrol commander to trust that the larger system will perform within a timeline that his 6 men can survive." "Yes." "That's a significant trust requirement."
Yes, Wicker said again. It is. The patrol commanders in the room were listening with the specific attention of people who are the subject of a proposal that will determine what their next patrol looks like and whether they come back from it.
There were 3 of them, Tran and 2 others, a sergeant named Callahan and a corporal named Westbrook, who had been running patrols in the Long Green for 4 months and who had the operational experience to evaluate the proposal against the specific texture of the terrain and the enemy they had been operating against. Tran was the one who spoke. He had the quality that Mercer had described to Wicker in the pre-meeting briefing, the honest assessor, the one who said what he thought rather than what the institutional context suggested he should think. Wicker had specifically requested that Tran be in the room because of this quality. "General," Tran said, "the Long Green contact, the 47 seconds. The patrol broke contact because the enemy was massing a response on our left flank. If we had held for an additional 2 minutes, the enemy's flanking movement would have cut our extraction route. How long would artillery have taken to suppress the flanking movement?" Tran looked at the map. He was calculating, Wicker recognized, not answering reflexively. Running the actual numbers against the actual terrain and the actual positions. From call to first round, 60 to 90 seconds in the northern sector. From first round to effective suppression of a massed flanking movement, another 60 to 90 seconds. 2 to 3 minutes total. In optimal conditions. The contact was at 0340. Darkness. The flanking movement was in vegetation that would have required multiple adjustment rounds to walk onto the correct position. 5 minutes, Wicker said. Call it 5 minutes from contact to effective fire suppression of the flank. Can 6 men hold a contact for 5 minutes against a company strength element? Tran was quiet for a long moment. The honest answer, Wicker could see him working toward it, was not simple. It was conditional. It depended on the terrain, the patrol's position, the enemy's organization, the specific calibration of suppression fire available. It was not yes, and it was not no, and the complexity of the honest answer was the thing that made Tran valuable in this room. In the Long Green contact's specific terrain, Tran said carefully, with the patrol position we had, 5 minutes was possible if the suppression fire was accurate and fast. The left flank position was in vegetation that the 55mm trajectory could have reached. The right flank was open enough for direct fire. He paused. It was possible. It was not certain. "Nothing in combat is certain," Wicker said. "No, sir." Tran looked at the map. The uncertainty in the hit and retreat doctrine is managed by removing the variable that creates it. We don't hold the contact, so the question of whether we can hold it for 5 minutes never arises.
The doctrine is designed to eliminate that uncertainty by eliminating that phase of the engagement. And by eliminating that phase, it also eliminates the outcome that phase could produce.
Yes, sir. Wicker looked at Hardington. Hardington had been listening to the exchange between Wicker and Tran with the expression of a senior officer watching a subordinate navigate a difficult conversation well, and processing the navigation as additional information about both the subordinate and the argument being made. "The doctrine can be modified," Hardington said. It was not a concession, it was an acknowledgement of what the conversation had established. The hit and retreat is not a fixed rule. It is a default calibrated for operations without fire support integration. If fire support integration changes the sustainability window reliably, the default changes. "Reliably," Wicker said. "That's the word that matters." "Yes, sir. The patrol commanders will hold contact if they trust the fire support will arrive within the window they can survive. If they don't trust it, they'll break contact at the default point, because the alternative is dying while they wait. Then the first question is whether the fire support can be made reliable enough to earn that trust.
Wicker looked at the map. I want to run a test operation, a full integration exercise.
SAS patrol makes contact, calls fire support, holds contact through the suppression phase, and a reaction force inserts to exploit the contact. He looked at Hartington. I'll provide the reaction force. Rangers from the 173rd. I'll provide the fire support coordination. Mercer's artillery and close air support on standby. He looked at Tran. I want you on the patrol.
Tran looked at him. Sir, the test operation. If the fire support doesn't arrive in time.
If the fire support doesn't arrive in time, you break contact at the default point and extract. The test fails, and we know why, and we fix it.
And if we can't break contact because the enemy's flanking movement has cut the extraction route?
Wicker held his gaze. Then the reaction force inserts, regardless of fire support status, and extracts you by force.
He paused.
I will not send 6 men into a test operation and leave them there if it goes wrong. The reaction force exists for both scenarios, the exploitation scenario and the rescue scenario.
Tran absorbed this. He was measuring it against the thing it was asking him to do, which was to change the decision calculus he had been using to keep himself and his patrol alive for 7 months in the Long Green. The hit and retreat doctrine had kept him alive. Wicker was asking him to modify it based on a trust in external systems that those systems had not yet demonstrated they could earn in the specific context he was being asked to trust them in.
When does the test operation run? Tran asked.
2 weeks, Wicker said. 1 week of joint planning and rehearsal with the reaction force and the fire support element. 1 week of final preparation. He looked at Tran. The rehearsal will build the trust. If the rehearsal doesn't build it, the test operation doesn't run. Tran looked at the map. He looked at it for a long moment with the complete attention that Wicker had come to recognize as his specific form of honest consideration. The look of a man who was not performing deliberation, but actually doing it. Agreed, Tran said. Hartington looked at Wicker. The test operations parameters. I want them in writing before the planning phase begins. You'll have them tomorrow morning, Wicker said. He was as good as his word. The parameters document was at Nui Dat by 0800 the following day. 12 pages that described the test operation with the precision that Wicker applied to everything. The patrol parameters, the fire support coordination protocol, the reaction force insertion criteria, the abort criteria, and the specific metrics that would determine whether the test had established the reliability that the patrol commanders needed to trust the modified doctrine. The abort criteria were the section that Hartington read most carefully.
They were specific and generous, weighted toward patrol survival rather than test completion, which was the correct weighting for a test that was asking patrol commanders to extend their survival window based on an unproven trust in external systems. Hartington read them twice and signed the coordination agreement. The planning week was different from any planning process either the SAS or the Rangers had previously run. It required the two elements which operated on entirely different timescales and with entirely different planning methodologies to build a shared operational picture that accounted for both timescales simultaneously. The SAS patrol planning operated on the hour-to-day timescale of a small unit moving in denied terrain. The Ranger reaction force planning operated on the minute-to-hour timescale of a heliborne force inserting into a hot landing zone. Mercer's fire support planning operated on the second-to-minute timescale of artillery and close air support integration. Making all three timescales function together required the kind of detailed rehearsal that Wicker had specified and that the planning week was designed to produce. They rehearsed the communication sequence 9 times.
They rehearsed the fire support call procedure 11 times.
They rehearsed the reaction force insertion sequence 7 times in conditions that degraded progressively from optimal to the specific conditions of the long green at night in monsoon weather, which was the probable condition of the actual test operation. By the end of the planning week, the 3 elements could execute the integrated sequence in darkness and rain with a coordination timeline that Mercer assessed as within the sustainability window that Tran had calculated in the Nui Dot meeting. Just within, not comfortably within, just. Tran noted this in the pre-operation assessment he gave to Hardington. The margin is acceptable, he wrote. It is not generous. Any degradation in the fire support response time or the reaction force insertion timeline will push the margin into the unacceptable range. Hardington showed the assessment to Wicker. Wicker read it and wrote one line in the margin. The margin will hold. TW. The test operation inserted on a Thursday at 0300, which was the time that Tran had assessed as optimal based on the long green's specific pattern of enemy activity, maximum enemy movement in the hours before dawn, maximum darkness for patrol concealment, maximum distance from the previous night's contacts that the D445 would be processing and responding to. The patrol was 6 men.
Tran leading, Callahan on point. 3 SAS operators whose names Wicker had in his briefing notes and whose faces he had memorized during the planning week, because he had made it a practice since Korea to know the faces of the men he was asking to do things that required trusting him. They inserted on foot from a vehicle drop point 4 kilometers south of the planned contact area. The insertion itself was standard SAS methodology: slow, silent. The deliberate pace that the long green required and that the Rangers observing from the drop point watched with the specific mixture of respect and impatience that American infantry brought to watching other people move more slowly than they would choose to move. The Ranger Reaction Force, 2 platoons from the 1st Battalion 173rd Airborne, was on standby at a forward landing zone 8 minutes flight time from the planned contact area. 8 minutes was the number that everything else in the test design had been built around, because 8 minutes was the difference between a reaction force that arrived during the contact and a reaction force that arrived after it. Mercer's artillery was pre-plotted on 6 fire missions covering the most probable contact positions and the most probable flanking routes from each. Close air support was on station at altitude, 2 Phantom jets carrying ordnance loads that Mercer had specified based on the long green's vegetation density and the expected enemy element size. Wicker was at the forward command post, which was a radio and a map board on a folding table inside a sandbagged position at the forward landing zone. He was with his operations officer, a major named Chen, and Hardington, who had come forward from Nui Dat to observe the test because sending patrol commanders into a test operation based on a trust in external systems and not being present to be part of the accountability for those systems was not something Hardington was willing to do. The patrol's progress was tracked through a system of scheduled radio checks on a frequency that used the one-time pad encryption and that Mercer's communications team had verified was clear of enemy monitoring. Every 30 minutes, Tran transmitted a 2-digit code that confirmed the patrol's position relative to the pre-planned movement grid. The checks came in, on schedule. The patrol was moving. At 0420, the check did not come. Wicker looked at the radio. He looked at Chen. Chen was already timing the gap from the scheduled transmission. 30 seconds passed. 1 minute passed. At 1 minute and 20 seconds, the radio produced Tran's voice, not the scheduled code, an actual transmission, compressed, urgent in the specific way of someone transmitting from a position where the transmission itself was a risk they had calculated was necessary. Command, Patrol Alpha, contact. Grid Victor Tango 44, multiple enemy, estimate platoon strength. We are in contact.
Request fire mission and reaction force. Now.
Wicker keyed his radio simultaneously with the acknowledgement that Chen was already transmitting. He was on Mercer's frequency. Mercer, contact. Victor Tango 44, Fire Mission 2, execute. Mercer's acknowledgement was immediate. Fire Mission 2, on the way. First round impact in 60 seconds. Wicker switched to the reaction force frequency. Hammer 1, command, execute. Grid Victor Tango 44, contact in progress, 8 minutes. The reaction force commander, a captain named Rodriguez, who had been sitting in his Huey for 2 hours with the specific alert patience of someone who has been told the call might come at any moment, and has decided that the correct response to that information is to be genuinely ready rather than performatively ready, acknowledged, and the Hueys lifted. Wicker looked at his watch. 0423. The fire mission was in the air. The reaction force was airborne. The patrol was in contact at Victor Tango 44. He keyed trans frequency. Alpha, command, fire mission 2 in 60 seconds. Reaction force 8 minutes. Confirm you can hold. The response took 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds of contact noise in the background. Small arms, at least one RPG, the specific acoustic signature of a patrol in a serious engagement. Command, Alpha, holding. Left flank is the problem. Fire Mission 2 covers left flank. Confirm. Confirmed. Fire Mission 2 is left flank.
First round in 30 seconds. The first round arrived at 0425. Mercer's adjustment call came 12 seconds after, walking the rounds 20 meters south onto the flanking movement position that the patrol's left was being pressured from. The second salvo was on target at 0427. The contact noise in transmissions changed. The flanking pressure was suppressed, not eliminated, suppressed. Command, Alpha, left flank suppressed, right flank still active. Can you? On it. Wicker was already on Mercer's frequency. Fire Mission 4, right flank, now. Fire Mission 4, on the way. 0429. The reaction force was 6 minutes out. The contact had been running for 6 minutes. Trans Patrol had been holding a contact with a platoon-strength enemy element for 6 minutes, with artillery suppressing both flanks, and had taken, according to the last transmission, 0 casualties. The margin was holding. At 0431, the right flank suppression rounds arrived. At 0432, Tran transmitted that both flanks were suppressed, and the enemy element to the front was beginning to disengage. At 0433, the close air support checked in, and Mercer put them on the disengaging enemy element's withdrawal route, one Phantom making a strafing pass that the patrol could hear from their position, and that produced in Tran's next transmission a quality that was not in his voice during any of the planning week rehearsals.
It was not relief. It was something more operational than relief. It was the specific recalibration of a man whose framework has just been tested against reality and has found that the framework requires adjustment in a specific and actionable direction. The reaction force arrived at 0436, 13 minutes after contact. The Hueys came in on the landing zone that Tran had designated in the pre-operation planning, 400 meters from the contact position, and Rodriguez had his 2 platoons on the ground and moving toward the contact position in 3 minutes. They reached Trans Patrol at 0442. The enemy element had partially disengaged during the air support run. Partially. Rodriguez's lead platoon made contact with the rear guard of the disengaging element at 0445, and the contact that followed was not the 47-second SAS engagement with its deliberate break. It was a Ranger contact, sustained, aggressive, with fire superiority established immediately through volume and the specific willingness to close with the problem that Ranger training produced
and that the enemy in the long green had been encountering with decreasing frequency as the SAS hit and retreat doctrine had made engagement brief and uncertain. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. It ended when the enemy element reached terrain that made further contact on the Rangers' terms impossible, and the withdrawal was complete.
Mercer's artillery was working the withdrawal route. The close air support was working the trail network north of the engagement area. At 0500, Rodriguez transmitted the contact result. 41 confirmed enemy killed, 17 wounded, of whom 9 were captured. The remainder of the platoon strength element, estimated at between 40 and 50 personnel, had withdrawn north under artillery and air interdiction in a state of organization that Rodriguez's after-action assessment would describe as significantly degraded. No Ranger casualties. No SAS casualties. Wicker looked at his watch. 0500. The contact had begun at 0423. From first contact to end of engagement was 37 minutes. In those 37 minutes, a 6-man SAS patrol had fixed a platoon-strength enemy element, artillery had suppressed its flanking response, close air support had disrupted its withdrawal, and 2 Ranger platoons had arrived and converted a small unit contact into a battalion-level engagement result. He looked at Hardington. Hardington was looking at the contact result figures on the radio log. He was looking at them the way he had looked at Wicker's test design parameters in the Nui DAT meeting, completely, without the selective reading of someone looking for confirmation. Reading what was actually there.
What was actually there was 41 confirmed enemy dead and 9 prisoners, from a contact that the standard SAS doctrine would have broken after 47 seconds, with an estimated 8 enemy casualties and 0 intelligence exploitation. The difference was 33 additional enemy dead, 9 prisoners, and the intelligence product of a sustained engagement that revealed the enemy unit's composition, equipment, and operational pattern in far more detail than a 47-second contact followed by immediate extraction could produce. "It worked," Hardington said, not with surprise, with the specific acknowledgement of a man who had believed it would work and found it more valuable to have the operational confirmation than to have been right without it. "It worked because everything performed within the parameters," Wicker said. "The fire support was on time, the reaction force was on time, the patrol held. All 3 variables performed." He paused. Any one of them performing outside parameters would have changed the outcome. "Yes. Which means the doctrine modification is only as reliable as the least reliable component." Hardington looked at him. This was the part of the conversation that went beyond the test operation and addressed the broader question of whether the modification was operationally viable across all the situations in which the SAS operated in Phuc Tuy province. "The least reliable component," Hardington said, "in the test operation was the margin between the contact's sustainability window and the reaction force arrival time. 13 minutes. Tran assessed the maximum sustainable window at 12 to 15 minutes with both flanks suppressed. We were inside that window, but not generously inside it. 8-minute flight time plus 3 minutes to landing zone," Wicker said. 11 minutes boots on ground. 2 minutes movement to contact. 13 total. The margin is 2 minutes. In optimal conditions, the test ran in conditions that were close to optimal. Real operations in the long green run in conditions that are frequently not optimal. What conditions degrade the reaction force timeline? Weather. The long green in monsoon is frequently below Huey operating minimums. The reaction force could not have inserted in the conditions we experienced 3 weeks ago. Wicker nodded. He had anticipated this. Close air support has lower weather minimums than Huey's.
In below minimum weather, the close air support takes the reaction force's suppression role, and the reaction force inserts when the weather lifts. The patrol holds with air support until the Hueys can fly. How long can the patrol hold with air support only? Mercer's assessment is that air support alone can suppress flanking movement for up to 20 minutes in the long green's vegetation density.
That's enough for the weather window to improve enough for Huey operation in most monsoon conditions.
Hardington processed this. You've already solved the weather problem? I've planned for it. Whether the solution works in a real weather event is a different question, which requires testing. Wicker agreed. They looked at each other across the map board in the sandbagged forward command post at the forward landing zone in the pre-dawn darkness of Phuc Tuy province. The generators were running. The radio was producing the ambient traffic of an operation winding down, units reporting positions, the artillery battery standing down from fire mission readiness, the close air support checking out to their return heading. In 400 meters of jungle, Trans Patrol was conducting its post-contact assessment, and Rodriguez's rangers were processing their prisoners and securing the engagement area with the methodical efficiency of units that have done what they were designed to do and are now doing the administrative work that follows. The doctrine modification, Hardington said. I'll recommend it to the task force commander with the caveat that it applies to operations where the fire support and reaction force components can be reliably guaranteed within the parameters the test established. That's the correct caveat, Wicker said. It will not apply to all SAS operations.
Some operations run in areas or conditions where the components cannot be guaranteed. In those operations, the hit and retreat default remains. Agreed. It's not a replacement for the doctrine. It's an expansion of the doctrine's option set. Hardington was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sky was beginning the specific pre-dawn lightning that preceded sunrise in Phuc Tuy's eastern horizon, the sky remembering a color other than black. You knew this would work, he said. It was not accusatory, it was observational. I knew the components could perform within the parameters if they were properly prepared and properly coordinated, Wicker said. I didn't know the patrol could hold. That was the variable I couldn't prepare. That depended on Tran and his men deciding to trust the system and then performing under contact while the system did what it was supposed to do. They held for 13 minutes. They held for 13 minutes in a contact that the doctrine told them to break at 47 seconds. Wicker looked at the contact result figures on the radio log. That's not a small thing. That's a significant departure from a deeply trained default under the specific conditions under which deeply trained defaults are hardest to override. Hardington nodded slowly. Tran. Yes. He was the right person to run the test. He was the right person because he was honest about what the doctrine required and honest about what the modification would require. And when we gave him the rehearsal time and the parameters and the abort criteria, he made an honest assessment that it was worth attempting. Wicker paused. He didn't trust us because we told him to. He trusted us because we showed him what the system could do and gave him the ability to abort if it didn't do it. Hardington looked at the pre-dawn sky for a moment. He had the quality at that moment of someone who has been running an argument in his head since a meeting 3 weeks ago and has now arrived at the conclusion the argument was working toward. Not because the conclusion was surprising, but because the operational confirmation made it available in a way that the theoretical discussion had not. The hit and retreat doctrine, he said, was calibrated for operations without reliable external support. It is the correct default for those conditions. It is not the correct default for all conditions. No. We had convinced ourselves it was the correct default for all conditions,
because the conditions where it was incorrect were the conditions we weren't creating. Wicker said nothing. This was Hartington's conclusion to reach, and Hartington was reaching it, and the value of him reaching it himself was greater than the value of Wicker confirming it.
The Americans create those conditions, Hartington said. The fire support, the reaction force, the coordination architecture that makes the sustainability window reliable enough to change the doctrine's default. He paused. We couldn't create those conditions with our resources. You can with ours. With yours, yes. Hartington looked at the mapboard, which is a different kind of combined operations than what we've been running. It's combined operations at the tactical level, Wicker said. The SAS patrol is the fixing element. The American fire support and reaction force is the exploitation element. The patrol does what the patrol does better than anyone. The Americans do what the Americans do better than the patrol can do with patrol organic resources. Neither element is subordinate to the other. They're complementary at the specific moment of contact. Hartington was quiet for a long moment. The sky continued its progression toward dawn. Somewhere north of them, in the long green, the remnants of the platoon-strength enemy element were moving through terrain that Mercer's artillery was working, and the close air support had finished working, and that Rodriguez's Rangers were too far behind to continue to contest. The enemy was degraded, disorganized, and moving away from the contact area without the certainty of where it was safe to go, which was the condition that the combination of fire, air, and maneuver was designed to create.
Tran will want to debrief this before the next operation, Hartington said. Of course. He'll have observations about what the fire support did and didn't do, and what the reaction force did and didn't do, that will be different from your observations, and Mercer's observations, and Rodriguez's observations. He was in the contact. The view from the contact is the view that changes the doctrine. Wicker nodded. The debrief is scheduled for 0800. I want all element leaders there. Tran's observations lead the discussion. Hartington looked at him. The economy of his expression had returned after the processing of the past hour, but it was a different economy than the one he had arrived at Nui Dat with a week ago. The same containment, the same deliberate minimal display. But the thing being contained was different. Not the protective caution of a man managing allied friction, the productive focus of a man who has resolved an argument in his own mind and is now thinking about what comes next. General, he said. Colonel, the test worked because you were right about the components and right about the patrol. You were also right about the doctrine. Wicker looked at him. The doctrine was right for the conditions it was designed for. It was wrong for the conditions you were designing, Hartington said. Both things are true. You were right to push on it. Wicker said nothing for a moment. Outside the sandbagged command post, the forward landing zone was doing its post-operation activity, the Hueys being refueled and repositioned, the ground crews working in the pre-dawn light that was now sufficient to see by without artificial illumination. Send Tran to me when the patrol gets back, Wicker said. Yes, sir. Tran arrived at 0640. He was wet and muddy and had the specific quality of someone who has been in a contact and has processed it enough to be functional and has not yet processed it enough to be finished with it. He sat across from Wicker in the command post and accepted the coffee that Chen provided and drank it in the way that people drank things after contacts, mechanically, using the familiar action to provide the body with something to do while the mind continued its processing. Wicker waited. He was good at waiting. Korea had taught him that the things worth knowing from people who had been in contacts came when you waited rather than when you asked. The left flank, Tran said finally. The suppression came at 0426. Mercer said 60 seconds from call to first round. It was 63 seconds. 3 seconds over, Wicker said.
In the actual contact, 3 seconds is the difference between the flanking element reaching a position where it can engage the patrol from cover and the flanking element being caught in the open when the round arrives. Tran held his coffee.
The round arrived when the flanking element was in the open. 3 seconds later, and they would have been in the vegetation on the left, and the suppression would have required adjustment rounds to walk onto them. Which would have added 30 to 40 seconds. Which would have put the total fire support response at approximately 90 to 100 seconds instead of 63. Which changes the sustainability calculation. Wicker looked at him.
What's the implication?
The implication is that 60 seconds is the planning figure, and 63 seconds is the actual figure, and the margin between the planning figure and the catastrophic failure figure is not as large as the planning figure suggests.
Tran set down his coffee. The doctrine modification works when the system performs within 3 seconds of its planning figure. That's a narrow tolerance for a system with the number of variables that fire support coordination has. What would widen the tolerance? Pre-plotting the fire missions more precisely for each patrol's specific terrain. We did 6 pre-plotted missions for the test. The left flank mission was pre-plotted to cover the most probable flanking position. In the actual contact, the flanking element was in the probable position. If they had been 50 meters north of the probable position, the adjustment would have added time. So, more pre-plotting. More terrain-specific pre-plotting. Not 6 missions for the patrol area, 12.
Covering the probable flanking positions at the patrol's specific planned halting points, rather than at the general patrol area level. Wicker looked at Mercer, who had arrived at the command post during the debrief and was listening with the specific attention of someone receiving technical feedback about his own system's performance. Mercer: 12 missions per patrol is manageable with the current battery tempo, Mercer said. It adds 2 hours to the pre-operation planning cycle. I'll need the patrol's planned halting points 48 hours in advance, rather than 24. Tran looked at him. That's a security constraint. The patrol's halting points, 48 hours in advance, is information that widens the exposure window if it's captured or compromised. It stays in the Fire Direction Center, Mercer said, not distributed, not on paper outside the FDC. I keep it in my head, and the targeting overlay. Tran was quiet for a moment. The security concern was real. The mitigation was also real. The question was whether the mitigation was sufficient, which was a judgment that required weighing a specific intelligence risk against a specific operational benefit. Acceptable, Tran said, with one condition. If the halting point schedule changes during the patrol, the update goes to the FDC immediately, regardless of transmission security constraints. Agreed, Mercer said. Wicker looked at both of them. They were doing what the test operation had been designed to produce. The specific, collaborative refinement of a combined methodology by the people who had been inside it during its first real application. The planning week had built the initial methodology. The test operation had produced the data that revealed its first-generation limitations. The debrief was producing the second-generation modifications. This was how doctrine developed in the field. Not through the formal process of institutional review and doctrinal publication, but through the iterative cycle of application, assessment, and modification that the people doing the application were best positioned to run. The formal process would follow. Wicker would write the test operation report, and it would go through MACV and the combined command structure, and eventually produce something that the institutional record could cite as the origin of the combined contact methodology that the two forces were developing in Phuoc Tuy province in 1968. The actual origin was a 47-second contact in the long green that Tran's patrol had broken in accordance with the SAS hit and retreat doctrine, and that Wicker had read about in an after-action report and described as leaving money on the table.
The formal record would not contain that description. The formal record would contain the methodology that the description had eventually produced. Both records were true.
They describe different things about the same process. Wicker had made his peace with this distinction long before Phuc Tuy Province. He carried the actual record in the personal operational notes that he maintained, with the same discipline he maintained everything else, systematically, honestly, without the institutional softening that the formal record required. The personal notes that covered the test operations debrief ended with a single observation that he wrote after Tran and Mercer had left and the command post was beginning its post-operation stand-down. He wrote, "The patrol held for 13 minutes because we gave them a system worth trusting and the time to verify that it was worth trusting before we asked them to trust it." The doctrine modification is not primarily about tactics. It is primarily about trust, specifically earned rather than assumed. Everything else follows from that. He closed the notebook. The sun was fully up. The long green was doing what the long green did after a significant contact, absorbing the disruption, resettling to its baseline, making no comment on what had happened and what it had meant. 41 enemy dead, 9 prisoners, 0 coalition casualties. 13 minutes. Different doctrine, same patrol, better outcome. The money was no longer on the table.